Hello. So usually I do these videos over in a different room, but I can't really do it for this one because I've got a massive stack of books over here. So I needed this bigger office space that I've got over here. Anyway, so this is my ranking video for all the Richard Laymon horror novels that I've been reviewing since July of last year. 35 books to come. So with that in mind, just two quick disclaimer clarifications. The first one is that someone had mentioned that I haven't reviewed the novel Cuts in this series. The reason for that is because Cuts was never published in the UK. It was a rejected novel. And this is just all the books that were published in my neck of the woods, England. In other words, everything published by Hodder and Stoughton's headline feature imprint. I haven't reviewed also Laymon's books for young adults. There's like Nightmare Lake and The Wilds. He also had I think he had a bunch of romance novels published under various pseudonyms, which obviously I haven't covered on this. This is, as far as I can get my hands on, every horror novel he wrote for adults and was published in the UK. The second thing I want to mention is just about the number of items here, 35 books. So anytime you've got that many items on a list, it's not exactly set in stone. You know, there's no real difference between position 18 and 17. The top and the bottom of the list, I gave a lot of thought to, but the stuff in the middle, it's pretty interchangeable. All right, well, with that said, let me get straight on with it. So, no, sorry, a third thing to say. All of these books you're about to see, if you haven't been following this series, have their own videos on my channel. I've reviewed all of them. And for that reason, I'm not going to say a huge amount about any of these. I'll just kind of sum them up a little bit as I go through them. So anyway, number 35, dead last, is Quake. For the simple reason that this is a little bit boring, and that's something which Laymon almost never is, and which Laymon should never be, because excitement is pretty much all he's got going for him as a writer. He wasn't the most gifted writer from a literary point of view. He never really cared all that much about characterization and big deep themes and stuff like that. He was just a writer who tried to entertain and to make people have fun, and this doesn't do that for me. It's really tedious. It's very long. It's his longest book in terms of page count. But we're following three groups of really unlikable characters who do pretty much nothing for 560 something pages. So for that reason, Quake comes in last. 35. Number 34 is Bite. This is one of those books he wrote where he had a really interesting premise, but he obviously didn't really know where to go with it. He was just making it up as he went along. And so where he goes with it, in my opinion, is just 400 pages of nothingness. Once you get past the really funny and intriguing opening chapters, then it's just a lot of nothingness, I'll say again, for the next 400 pages, with a very unsatisfying resolution. Nothing is really explained about what had actually happened here. So for that reason, Bites comes in at number 34. Number 33, After Midnight. When I finished my review of this book, I was pretty scathing in my review, and I was pretty sure this was going to be a lock-in for last on this list, because it is bad. In my opinion, I know someone had mentioned on the comment section that this was their favorite book of his, which I love. I absolutely love when that happens, when something that I personally don't like, it's someone else's favorite, because it's just nice to think that everything in the world is loved by someone. And I completely understand why that person likes this book, but it just doesn't do it for me. But then why isn't it dead last? It's because, for all of what I think of its flaws, this thing does have a few scenes which have stayed with me, whereas the Bite and Quake hasn't. I barely remember a thing about them, but this does have a couple of scenes which have stuck in the memory. Most notably, this book has Laymon's best kill. Bizarrely enough, it's this, of all the books, has by far his best kill. Without being too graphic, it involves a large hunting knife, a very pissed off young woman, and a potential rapist's rear end. Say no more. But yeah, very that was one hell of a piece of description that Laymon threw in there. So for that reason, it doesn't finish dead last. It finishes at number 33. Next up, No Sanctuary. I think this was the first of his novels to be published after his death, and it feels a bit cobbled together. I don't think he assembled it quite like this, because it feels like two very distinct ideas that have been pushed together. One part of this book is actually pretty interesting, the part with Gilliam the young woman who breaks into people's homes and pretends that she lives there. That was fun, but the stuff with the two campers, Bert and Rick, that's just, it's just very, very, a lot of nothingness, very boring, and I didn't quite understand why it was there. So No Sanctuary, it's not bad by any means, but it's just very forgettable. Next up, Friday Night in Beast House, the coda to the Beast House series. Now, the Beast House series of books is one of the most important series of books to me as a reader of horror fiction, so it's nice to have this as one last fond farewell to the Beast House. But having said that, it is incredibly slight, this book. There's only really two characters in the thing. Much of the narrative involves a young guy hiding out in Beast House drinking a Pepsi. Not much goes on, but like I said, it's still kind of fun to have this, and it's very nice to see Sandy one last time, because Sandy is my favorite Richard Laymon character, so it was good to get a wave, literally get a wave from her. All right, next up is Amara, another book of his published posthumously. If No Sanctuary is 2 stories pushed together, this is about 50 of them squashed together. We've got a mummy, which supposedly is the main bulk of this story, but it really isn't. But anyway, so we've got something about an escaped mummy. There's this crazy blind woman who's enslaving young people for sex purposes. Don't know why. It's not really explained why she's going to those lengths to do it, because she's described as... All right, I won't go there. And then we've got another strand involving these 3, I think it was, young people going to Hollywood to try and make it big in films. It's all over the place. I mean, they've obviously gone through Richard Laymon's drawers and the furthest reaches of his desk after he died, and just anything he had left over, they've created this Frankenstein's monster of a novel. But it's fitting, really, that it is a Frankenstein's monster, because it's supposedly about the undead. Another thing they did is they took a short story of his that had been published some years before and just put it in here, right in the middle. A short story called Into the Pit. They've put that in there almost without changing a single word of it. Really weird, but I can't say it's not fun. I think I had a pretty good time reading this. It's a bit unique in its structure, in its form. You won't really know where the hell this thing is going from one page to the next. So Amara, right, next up is one of 2 giallos Laymon wrote, Alarums. It's a strange book, because every time I read this, I always remember having a really good time with it. But a week or so later, I can't remember a thing about it. And that's true of now. For example, I read this not that long ago, a couple of months back, I think. But if you ask me now exactly what happened in it, I couldn't tell you. Something about someone tried to bump off a rich father for some reason. It's the strangest thing. I mean, it is a well-written book, but it just doesn't stick in the memory at all. It's such a forgettable novel, how it erases itself from the mind. But I do recommend reading it, because it's not bad at all. All right, next up, controversial one. This is a fan favorite, The Woods Are Dark. Since my review, when I pretty much trashed this, I have read the uncut version of the novel, but it didn't do much to elevate it off this part of the list, because there's very little about this book that I engage with. I don't like the characters. The story does nothing for me. So without story and without fun characters, what really are you left with in a Richard Laymon horror novel? Not a lot. So again, I do appreciate that this is a fan favorite, but it's just not for me. And this is all about tastes and personal opinion. Next up, another early novel of his, Night Show. I like this because it's a kind of homage to 1980s horror cinema. The main character, Danny Larson, is a Hollywood horror special effects queen, as they call her on the back here. And there's all kinds of references in this book to like Rick Baker and Tom Savini. And it feels like an ode to the horror cinema of my youth, and I guess the youth of many people watching these videos. So I like it on that level. But it's not a very well-written book. The writing is weak and very immature by Laymon's standards. Danny Larson, for example, this woman, she's so gullible when it comes to dealing with this teenage creep, Tony Johnson. So, yeah, it's let down by the characters and to an extent the story. But anyway, next up, All Hallows Eve. Yeah, this is a really bad book. This was written before Laymon was a published writer. His first novel was published in 1980, and this was written in the late 70s. It was rejected by all the publishers in the world, it looks like. But then I think what happened is in the mid 80s, Laymon's publishers asked him, have you got anything lying around we can just get out under your name because your books are really starting to sell now in the UK. So he's given him this without correcting any of its flaws, any of the reasons that it was rejected. He hasn't set them straight. But it's kind of fascinating to me as a huge Richard Laymon fan. This is a piece of Laymon history, because we're getting a window into the earliest of early Richard Laymon, and it reads almost like a kind of creative writing exercise that he was set at university, because it starts well, it tapers off a bit in the middle. The less said about the end, the better. But he gave it a go, and really, yeah, what I feel like I'm reading here is a writer learning his craft in real time. So, yeah, for that reason, I have a lot of affection for this, and it has an absolutely epic cover. Cliched as hell, but you can't possibly go wrong with any of those elements, can you? A full moon, a creepy, what looks like churchyard, a dilapidated old house, a rickety fence. They don't make them like that anymore. I mean, the big horror publishers, they don't go the extra mile anymore. It's all generic stuff. Next up is another fan favourite, but it's relatively low on my list, One Rainy Night. I appreciate that Laymon decided to get a little bit political in this, and I do think, even though the subtext is piled on with a sledgehammer, it's hardly subtle, but it is always a good theme to take on, the idiocy and destructive nature of racism, told here by the metaphor of a black rain coming down and coating everybody, which happens after a horrendous racist murder of a black boy. So I do like the basic premise of it. It's just too long. It's 400 and something pages, and once the rain comes down in the opening chapter, it is then just people being horrific to each other. It's a very good example of the splatterpunk genre. There's huge amounts of violence and nastiness in this. If you're into that, then this is for you. Like I said, it is a fantastic example of its kind. I just happen not to like its kind all that much, but it is a well-written book. So anyway, next up, Resurrection Dreams. This is kind of a zombie novel, and it's the closest Laymon would ever come to writing a horror comedy. I do like it, but I'm just not that all into zombies as a subgenre of horror. I have very few zombie films in my collection. You can't see it, but this room is from floor to almost ceiling is covered with shelves with horror films, and there are, I would say, not even 20 of them are zombies. And I have very, very few novels which are zombies. So yeah, for that reason, I just don't really connect to this one all that much. But I do know, again, it's a fan favorite, and I get why, because it's a fun read. It really is. Resurrection Dreams. Right, next up is a excuse me. This was a big surprise for me. Beware. I say surprise because going into this reread, I thought this was going to finish way down the list, because the first time I read this book, I didn't like it at all. And the reason I didn't like it is because I thought by the synopsis on the back and by the way it begins, I thought this was going to be a ghost story. And ghost stories are my favourite subgenre of horror. It isn't a ghost story, it's a barking mad tale of an invisible man. But once I knew that, it means that going into the reread a few months back, I was able to just appreciate it on its own terms. And on those terms, I had a lot of fun with this. This is kind of unique in my opinion. I at least don't know anything quite like this in horror fiction. So kudos to Laymon for that. It's a good time, it really is, and I was very surprised by just how much fun I had with this once I was able to put aside my disappointment at it not being what I thought it was going to be. So Beware comes in there, and that rhymes. Next up is the most recent book that I reviewed, The Lake, another posthumous novel of his. And again, like with Amara, I don't think that he assembled it quite this way, but he certainly did write it. This has his literary trademark stamp all over it. Like I said in my review, this is basically a slasher film told in prose. It has the basic elements of a slasher. You've got some tragic incident that happened 20 odd years before, and then somebody involved in that incident comes back all these years later to avenge the wrongs. Yeah, pure slasher, but it works really well. It flows very well. This is such a readable book. I was never bored by this. And so yeah, if you like slasher films or the slasher genre, this is one for you, I think. And the last of his posthumous novels comes in next, The Glory Bus. In fact, the last novel of his the last novel to ever be put out under the Richard Laymon name. This was published 4 years after his death. This is really weird. This is a surreal piece of fiction. Again, it's not exactly how Laymon wrote it. I'm sure that they've again cobbled together various bits and pieces that he had left behind, a short story from here, a novella from there, a sketch from over there, a vignette from here, a paragraph, and somehow they've worked it all up into this bonkers tale of what? I don't even know where to begin summarizing this, because there's so many different elements going on, but ultimately it all leads up to this kind of commune of cannibals in the desert. A hell of a fun read with some really interesting characters, and unusually for Richard Laymon, because he was such a simplistic writer. This has a uncommonly well depicted psychopath, the character of Duke. I think Laymon did a really, for him, impressive job there of depicting an incredibly dangerous person who has this superficial charm and coldness, like he can be in total control of his emotions, this unnatural control he has, but then he can just explode and just be sickeningly vicious and violent in an instant. That I thought for Richard Laymon was something new when he actually tried to depict what psychos are really like. So anyway, yeah, The Glory Bus, that comes in there. Right, okay, next up is a very controversial one, I suppose. This is really a fan favourite. Island. Why is it so low? I mean, it's in the middle of the list. Because I can't stand the narrator, Rupert. This is told in the first person, so to spend 500 odd pages in the company of this perpetually aroused... Is he a teenager? I don't remember. He's either a teenager or the very early 20s. But if you take all the annoying elements of the young Richard Laymon horny man, roll them into one, you get Rupert. This kid cannot go 5 minutes without catching a glimpse of someone's breasts or getting an erection over the slightest visual stimulus. So yeah, I mean, it's a shame as well, because the story of this is fantastic. I love the setting. The premise is great. If it hadn't been first person, if it hadn't featured Rupert, this would be way higher up my list. But that's not the only thing dragging it back. I really didn't like the ending of this. I don't mean the very, very ending, where, Rupert kind of becomes the bad guy in some way. I mean that stuff with the cages and the underage girls being raped. I mean, Laymon did sometimes have this habit of shoehorning in child rape. Not because I think there was anything weird about him in that way, just because I think that he figured it was the most shocking thing you could ever do, so get it in there. But to me, it's a little bit lazy to do that, especially when he does it, because I'll talk more about this when I talk about the Cellar later on. But if you are going to put that in your fiction, I think you should take it slightly more seriously than he does, rather than just, oh, this will shock them, get it in there. Because if you do that, it actually isn't shocking. It's even boring. Somehow Laymon turns child sexual abuse into a tedious descriptive experience, whereas it should horrify. It never does with him. But again, more on that when I get to the Cellar. So that's why Island comes in middle of the pack. Loved the basic idea, loved the setting, but I cannot stomach Rupert. Much the same in a way can be said of Body Rise. It's another book which I thought was going to be way down the list, but it's relatively higher than I thought it would be, because this has really stayed with me. This is massively too long. It's like 200 pages too long. If you cut out all the mind-numbingly tedious descriptions of sex, 100 pages have been thrown out. If you then cut out all the banal dialogue between Neil and his various women, there goes another 100 pages. But at the core of this is a fantastic, innovative, fascinating, intriguing 300-page short novel involving a bracelet that enables you to take body rides. And it's just a pity that it's so bloated, because that can sometimes get buried in among all the tedious crap. So I'm going to be taking a bit of a break from Laymon for a while, because I've just binge read the guy. But when I do go back to rereading a book of his, this is the one I'm most looking forward to rereading, because a lot of this has really stayed with me. But again, the main drawback is the main character of Neil. Like Rupert there, he is this really unlikable, insufferably horny young guy who, I think he's 26 years old, but again, even though he's in a sexual relationship, he can't go 10 minutes without catching a glimpse of the side of a woman's breast. And up comes the erection every single time. Alright, so anyway, Body Rides comes in there. Next up, Midnight's Lair. Now we're starting to get into the part of the list where I pretty much love the books to come in. I only really dislike 3 of his novels, Quake, Bite, and After Midnight. I kind of like everything I've just spoken about, even though they have their flaws. Everything from here on, I either really like or absolutely love. Midnight's Lair. I really like books like this, where a writer takes such a simple idea and he doesn't waste any words telling that idea. It's exactly as long as it needs to be. This is a short book. It's a very quick read because it only needed to be a quick read. People trapped in a cave with these kind of creatures circling around them. It's a great setting. It's such a... this book describes constant action. It's breakneck pace, and that's a very difficult thing to do if you're a fiction writer. Laymon makes it seem easy. It isn't. There is a reason why, even though he was in many ways a bad writer, there is a reason why in the 80s and the 90s, British bookstores were full of Richard Laymon's novels and not better writers. It's because there's a lot to be said for this kind of thing, when you can just get a reader to turn pages at breakneck pace. So Midnight's Lair. By no means is it some epic, ingenious idea. No, it's his simplest idea in many ways. But he somehow manages to make a very simple, cliched idea incredibly readable. So I love this, Midnight's Lair. Next up is a fan favorite. This is often a lot of people's number 1 Richard Laymon book, The Traveling Vampire Show. And it's easy to see why this is a lot of people's number 1. This is a very well-written piece of fiction for Laymon. But it's not really a horror novel to me. This is a kind of a coming-of-age story, a bit like Stephen King's The Body, filmed as Stand By Me. And I do love this, though, because it's clearly, in many ways, a window into Laymon's own childhood. I mean, it's set exactly when he was this age. And there's all kinds of very oddly specific details in this, which reminded me of my own childhood with my friends. So I love it on that level. A great book. I mean, I can't really criticize anything about this. It's just that it's not one I really think about all that much. It's not one I have any particular desire to go back to, because I am very happy that Laymon did something new here. A coming-of-age story for him at this time in his career was very different to what he'd done. Huge respect to him for that. But I go to Laymon for slightly different things. So, Traveling Vampire Show is there. Much the same can be said of this one here, Night in the Lonesome October. A very interesting idea, very interesting structure. There's really not a lot of plot to this. It's just a young guy who's heartbroken, decides to do a Forrest Gump. He just ups and goes for a walk to try and leave behind his pain. And along the way, he runs into all kinds of adventures and misadventures. I like so much about this book, but again, similar to Island, I cannot stand Ed Logan, the main character and the narrator. It's another first person, so I'm locked in his headspace for 470 pages. And this guy is the most whiny, mopey, entitled character I've ever had the misfortune to share a headspace with. I mean, he's heartbroken. It says on the back here, Ed, he's heartbroken, half mad with despair. Ed can't study, can't sleep. Now, we've all been there. Usually when we were his age, he's like in his very early 20s. But there are ways of dealing with heartbreak that allow you to keep your dignity, and he doesn't manage that on any level. He's just a pathetic character. But anyway, there are a lot of good things in this. You can go and see my review if you want to know what all the good things are. But Night in the Lonesome October, it's a fan favourite, but not one of mine. I think we're into something like the top 15 now. Yes, we are. So that would mean that number 15 is The Beast House. This is the second book in his Beast House series. I really like this because it fleshes out a bit the mythos of Beast House. The Cellar was such a brief and in many ways confusing and vague read. Nothing was really explained about what the hell was going on there. This tells us, to some extent, what the beast is, where it came from, how it came to be there. We get to see some of the old characters from the Cellar, but we're introduced to some new ones. A good read, and like I said earlier, it's part of one of the most important series of books to me, the Beast House Chronicles. So the Beast House, number 15, sorry. Number 14 is the best of his early work, Out Are the Lights. I know some people aren't too keen on this one, but I just love that this feels similar to what I said about Night Show. This is like an homage to 80s horror cinema. All those trashy, straight to VHS horror films that we, at least of my generation, that we grew up on, this is an ode to them. And I think it's a fantastic story. I love all the little short stories, like the short films they're supposedly making to be broadcast as real films, but in fact they're kind of snuff films. I like the detail of the main female character being deaf, because that plays in quite cleverly for Laymon into a plot reveal at the end. So Out Are the Lights. Like I said, in my opinion, this is the best of his early novels. And the first novel where he would be in real control of his craft. This is a well-composed piece of fiction. From start to finish, it feels really well-rounded. Everything is resolved nicely at the end. Nothing is left untied. Really good achievement there for the young Richard Laymon. 26 minutes, well. Coming in at number 13 is the second of the two giallos he would write, Among the Missing, by far the superior one. This is really well plotted. It's clear that Laymon spent a lot of time and trouble thinking this one out and carefully planning the different twists and turns. This has one of the most tense scenes in Richard Laymon towards the end, maybe the most tense scene for me. Like the story, like the characters, it's kind of obvious as you go on who the killer is, who the bad guy is. But that doesn't really detract from it, because I think I said this in my review. It's called dramatic irony, isn't it? When you, the reader or the viewer, know something that the characters don't. For me, knowing who the killer was added to the tension of what followed. So I really liked that about it. Among the Missing, a really cool, it's unusual for him. It's not really a horror novel. It's a giallo mystery thriller, and definitely worth a read. Number 12, Dark Mountain, his Horror in the Woods novel. I'm a massive fan of any kind of horror that's set in the woods, whether it's a slasher film or a novel. I used to do a bit of camping as a kid, so it resonates with me on that level. I love the structure of this. It starts out in the forest, it moves to the city, and then it ends back in the woods. Good story, good atmosphere. He does do a good job of evoking the campy, woodsy atmosphere. So, Dark Mountain. And number 11, a massive surprise, come out tonight. All of these books that I'm speaking about now, I had read before this reread of the last 6 months, except this one. This was a first-time read for me, because I had put off reading this. The reason for that is because it's one of those where the synopsis on the back tells you nothing about what the book is about. It tells you what happens in the first 5 pages. And so when I read that, I thought, Christ, here we go again. It's going to be like Bite. It's going to be like No Sanctuary. It's going to be another one of those books where he had an idea for the beginning, but no idea how to continue it. So they haven't even bothered to hide that fact on the back. I could not have been more wrong. This is a really, really good read. And what I most remember about this is, this was the second book I reviewed on this series. I reviewed it in July of 2020. In other words, the height of the coronavirus lockdown. And we all here were locked in our houses. And where I live now in the northwest of Russia, St. Petersburg, it was sweltering hot. Like, this place gets really, really hot and muggy in the summer with like mosquitoes everywhere. It's very uncomfortable type of heat. And I read this book over there on the sofa behind me in this very room, and it was boiling hot. And this book uses heat as a motif of the novel. Heat is very important to this book, both in terms of setting the atmosphere, but also, unusually for Laymon, he uses it in a kind of imagistic way of expressing the heat of the two lovers and all this other stuff. And Laymon does a very good job in this book of depicting this type of sapping, debilitating heat that just wipes you out and makes you feel so uncomfortable. So I remember that reading this book back then was, I could really relate to it. But even beyond that, it's such a fun read. I mean, this is another breakneck pace story that I just didn't want to ever put down. So an excellent, excellent book, written right at the end of his career as well. Strange that, because he was in a bit of a slump at that point. That was when he did like Bite and After Midnight and Quake and stuff like that. He was starting to run out of ideas a bit, and he really came back with stuff like this. Right, into the top 10. We're at the half-hour mark. Sorry about this. Number 10, Endless Night. So this is a very violent novel. This is the nastiest of his books. A lot of people rank this one much higher than where I've got it. It is great. It really is. It's an excellent example of the splatterpunk subgenre. But it doesn't have a great deal of story to it. It doesn't have a great deal of narrative to it. And for that reason, I decided to put it definitely in the top 10. It has to be a top 10 Laymon book because it's one of his best written books. But I also made the decision to put it last in the top 10 because the other 9 books have much better stories. And story is such an important thing for me with Laymon. So number 10, Endless Night. Number 9, here we come to this nasty little thing here, The Cellar. Yeah, so in my review, I'd said this is Laymon's most problematic novel. And what I meant by that, and what I explained by that, is that this book contains so much nastiness in its 250 pages. A lot of people hate this book, and it deserves to be hated in some ways. So, like I said in Ireland, yeah, this is the one with all the child rape. This is the one where Laymon has shoehorned in many descriptions of a 9-year-old girl being raped. And in my introduction video to this series of videos, I had said that Laymon, for all the rape and the child abuse that appears in his books, he never really looks at the true horror of those things. He doesn't deal with the psychological, emotional, physical after effects of it. People are just raped and then they recover in some way, almost instantly, which I just don't like. I mean, if you are going to take on this subject, I think there are some subjects you should treat a little bit seriously, and child sexual abuse is certainly top of that list. So I don't like that about the book. And I also don't like that we never really find out what happened to that girl. She just disappears at the end. I think that Laymon should have let us know what became of her. But anyway, just for all of its many, many, many flaws, I have a great deal of affection for this book because, for number one, it's his first novel. So it set him on the path to doing all of this work that I'm talking about now. It's such a strange idea. I'm on board with that. Love the setting. Malcastle Point, the Beast House itself, the Kutch House across the road. All of these locations are among my favorite locations of Laymon. And we're introduced to Sandy, who, like I said, is my favorite Laymon character. So anyway, The Cellar. I think this is a very missold book as well, because this image on the front, and it leads you to believe that it's kind of a haunted house book, which of course it isn't. It even says on the back here, the haunted structure. And Stephen King in Danse Macabre, he dismissed this book and he described it as a haunted house novel, which makes me question if he actually read it, because it isn't a haunted house book. Anyway, The Cellar, number 9. Number 8, the third in the Beast House Chronicles, The Midnight Tour. A bit of an epic for Laymon. I absolutely love this. This is everything I could have wanted the final main book in the Beast House series to be. Laymon died a very young man. He was like 54 or something when he died. And he was very obviously intending to continue this series of books, because the Midnight Tour ends in exactly the same way as The Cellar ends. In other words, it doesn't end. It stops. There's a difference between ending a book and stopping it. And this one just kind of stops right in the middle of action. So he was clearly going to write more, or at least one more book in this series, which we never got because he passed away 2 years after publishing this. But yeah, I mean, this is a book about Sandy first and foremost, and her later alias of Eva. And even though, like, there's one character in this, I don't remember his name, but he's the guy who is like always beaten down by that girlfriend of his. He's such a wimp. I mean, I couldn't stand him and all the chapters involving him. But except that was the only real flaw in this book. Everything else I loved about it. So The Midnight Tour. Number 7, Flesh. The first of Richard Laymon's truly great novels, published, I think, in 1987. And this was the first of 3 novels to be nominated for the Bram Stoker Award. Fantastic idea, very, very gruesome, as it suggests there in that cover art. If I were ranking these books based on how well written they are or how original they are, this would be higher up the list, top 5 for sure. But I think 7 is where I'm going to place it on the list of books that I happen to enjoy the most. It's a lot of people have said this is their number 1. It's easy to see why. But anyway, let me crack on with this because this is really getting on 35 minutes. Number 6, Darkness Tellers. This is the simplest of Laymon's novels. Even though it's 500 and something pages, if you read this, you'll read it in no time at all, because this is his most simplistic writing. The whole thing is told in almost dialogue and one-sentence paragraphs. And it's in some ways a very immaturely written novel. And it's got another one of those obnoxious, horny young characters of his. But, you know, I am obsessed with Ouija board films, Ouija board novels. Over there, I have an entire shelf of my film collection devoted to Ouija board films. There's something like 40 horror films there. And so for that reason, I love this. I also love the character of Angela. I like how this book is resolved. I like how all the elements come together, as implausible and contrived as they are. So yeah, Darkness Tellers comes in at number 6. So into the top 5. Number 5, Blood Games. Reviewed this one a couple of reviews back. I absolutely love that this book is an all-female cast. It means we are spared, more or less, the horny young Richard Laymon teenage boys, I mean. And I love the cast of this. I like all the 5 girls. I really enjoy the flashback sequences, like the short stories that he put in there, showing the girls growing as a group and bonding and forming that tight-knit friendship that they have. Really love it. Like the setting of this and the swimming pool aspect of it. So yeah, Blood Games comes in at number 5. Number 4, In the Dark. I think this is Laymon's best idea. In some ways it's his simplest idea, but it's his best one as well. A really well-told story. This is a very unusual book for Laymon because there are no unlikable characters. I like everyone here. Jane and her guy Brace. And even though, like I said in my review, the one flaw of this book is that I would have liked a better explanation of why this Master of Games character is doing any of this. I thought that he was going to be connected in some way to Jane, and that's why he's spending tens of thousands of dollars on effectively trolling her. But no, there's nothing like that. So I was a bit disappointed that, you know, I think the resolution could have been a bit better. But despite that, you know, everything else about this is tremendous. So In the Dark is number 4. Number 3, The Stake. I absolutely love this because it's a window into Richard Laymon himself. The main character, Larry Dunbar, is very obviously Laymon, modeled on Laymon. He's a 40-odd year old horror writer living in California with a teenage daughter. The story of this, where they come across a corpse in a coffin in a ghost town, did actually happen to Richard Laymon, apparently, if you believe what he says, and I frankly do. It wasn't a vampire, of course, it didn't have a stake in its heart, but it was just a body in a coffin in an abandoned hotel that he came across with some friends. So we get to see how he writes. We get to see his thoughts on the process of writing and horror fiction, and some aspects of his own biography concerning the publication of The Woods Are Dark. Yeah, this is one of the first horror novels I ever read as well, so it's got some kind of sentimental value to me on that level. The Stake, number 3. All right, let me bring these both over then. Right, I had said in my last video of The Lake that I really agonized in some way over what my number 1 would be. This was a struggle between head and heart because my head knows that one of these books is his best novel. It's barely even a debate, even though this is all subjective and it's a matter of taste. In terms of style, in terms of command of the craft of writing, one of these books is head and shoulders above everything else he wrote. The other one is one of the most important novels to me by anyone in my journey as a horror reader, because it was the first horror novel I ever purchased with my own money. It's the first one I ever read. And it's a story which it's got some of my favorite characters of all time. So in the end, I've decided that my number 1 pick is going to be what I consider to be his greatest book. And number 2 then is going to be the book which is perhaps most special to me. It doesn't mean I prefer it over number 1. It just means it's got more history to it. And that is Funland. And this is the very copy that I bought as a 14-year-old boy. I remember buying this like it was yesterday in Hammock's Bookshop in Oldham, England. Bookshop's still there. And yeah, the cover art, you know, I was obsessed with that cover art on the shelf. That's the main reason I wanted to buy it, because I love theme parks, especially at night. So yeah, Tanya. The character of Tanya is one of my favorite characters of all time. I absolutely love the setting of this. I love most of the characters. Robin, the banjo player, fantastic character. Nate, who she gets involved with. The only drawback of this, like I said in my review, is Laymon had this very odd self-imposed rule when he was writing his lengthy novels, that the books had to have 100 pages for an ending, which is an odd rule to put upon yourself. And this didn't need 100 pages finale, because it meanders a bit. Everything up to page 370 or so is really breakneck paced and page turning, you know. But then when they go inside the funhouse, not only is it a bit tedious, but it confuses everything, because then I'm left confused about what the hell is actually going on here. How are these trolls connected to Jasper? Why are these freaks being imprisoned there, and why are they allowing themselves to be imprisoned there by this short guy who seems very easily bested? Like, this is a very escapable situation they're in here. So yeah, the ending was a bit of a letdown, because it ended up confusing the issue. But warts and all, flaws and all, it still comes in at number 2, because this is a very, very, very important book to me in my history of horror fiction reading. Which means that number 1, Richard Laymon's best novel, is Savage, published in 1993. And Laymon himself, in an interview in the late 80s, had said that he hoped this would be the book he's remembered by. He thought this was his greatest book as well. And I wish that he was around to see me make this video and tell him, huge thank you, Mr. Laymon, for all the stuff you did and for this book, because you really got it right with this one. Now, as I said in my review of this, please don't blame me if you now go away and get this book and read it and you think, what the hell is this? This is not even a horror novel. This is some kind of romantic Western. Yes, it is. In many ways, it is. There are horrific elements to this in the beginning and at the end with the Jack the Ripper stuff. But Jack the Ripper disappears for the vast majority of this book, and then it's really a coming-of-age story of Trevor Bentley. But it's a much better coming-of-age story, in my opinion, than Night in the Lonesome October was. This is by Laymon's standards, this is a very rich novel. He uses description like he never used before in this, and he paints images and he evokes the atmosphere of his vast landscape. I mean, this takes place on, for him, an epic scale. We have the freezing cold, well, let's start from the beginning. We've got the rain-drenched, foggy London streets. Then we get the snowy, freezing cold New York, and then he goes to the blistering heat of the American West. All of this takes place over a span of something like 6 months or 9 months. And again, by Laymon's standards, he really does do a wonderful job of evoking these various different atmospheres and places. Laymon tended not to bother with setting a sense of place, but in this one, not only did he up his game, he took it to an entirely different level. I would never have thought he was capable of writing something like this. It does have its flaws. This is by no means a flawless work. I mean, some of the writing is, again, this very awkward mix of what he imagined to be 19th century British English, but he's kind of married it to these 20th century Americanisms, like gal. He often says gal for girl, which, trust me on this, no Brit ever says. Certainly not 150 years ago. So yeah, I mean, but again, he gave it a go. A massive respect to him for trying something new here. It was his agent who suggested to him he tries a novel in an English setting. And above all else, what a fantastic idea. The idea that the reason we don't know what became of Jack the Ripper is because of Trevor Bentley and his exploits here. It's such a simple but original idea that no one had thought of before. So let me end this up then on the 45-minute mark. Richard Laymon's Savage is my number 1 novel by him. But can I just repeat, please do not blame me if you now rush out to read this on my recommendation and you're bored to tears by it because you think, what on earth is this? This is just some tedious romantic Western novel with a bit of butchery thrown in. Oh, can I just end on one other thing? I absolutely love the character of Jessie in this. She appears kind of towards the end, but she is, after Sandy, my favourite Richard Laymon character. That's going to do it, guys. That's wrapping up my series of 35 Richard Laymon horror novel reviews. Thanks very much for watching some of these videos, if you did watch them, and for commenting on them now and again. I've really appreciated the input, and it's nice to know that there are other Richard Laymon fans out there who feel the same love for him that I do. On Valentine's Day of this year will be the 20th anniversary of his death, so maybe just think about him on that day, raise a glass to his memory for this fantastic body of work that he left us. I really wanted to do this series of videos because I think he should be better known, and he should have some more praise than what he has. So that's going to do it. Moving forward, I am going to now be moving on to other horror novels. I'm not going to be doing another series for a while. I'm just going to take like a James Herbert book and review that, a Bentley Little book and review that, a Ramsey Campbell from here, maybe a Stephen King. Because to devote 7 months of your life just to one writer, it's not easy to do. And I'm also going to I want to do a series of videos on Clive Barker's Books of Blood. I want to do a separate video for each of the short stories and discuss those. All right, anyway, that's going to do it. So thanks again, everyone, for watching this. If you did watch it, I'll be very surprised if you did watch all 46 minutes, but thanks for watching any of it. Take care of yourselves, everybody, and I'll be back soon with another video. So bye for now.